We discovered the tomb of the children taken from Bethlehem by King Herod. We never should have opened it. Alome, toparch of Jamnia, Azotus and Phasaelis, daughter of Antipater of Idumea, has commissioned this to honor her brother, Herod ben Antipater, king of Judea, who is imprisoned within. To who it be that look upon this monument do no more than read that which is inscribed on these walls. Let the king's torment remain contained. Within these walls lies an evil that I was burdened to watch ensnare and torment one of whom I loved. As toparch over the lands on which this tomb resides, it is my duty to keep that which lies within contained, including my brother, by sealing it thus, and providing a warning in the form of my own experiences of what I saw. Ever since the conspiracy of his harlot wife Mariamne, and later that of the 2 sons born out of that marriage, Herod's paranoia to threats against his reign consumed him. Any hint of such he countered with extreme measures. Many heads had rolled. Yet, for some, at least those I deemed to be innocent, it was well that he confided closely in me. My interventions prevented many unnecessary deaths, except for what happened in Bethlehem. It all began when those 3 magicians from the east entered into his court. They had come to Judea in pursuit of what their trained eyes had claimed to be a star of incredible portents that had appeared for only a single night, 2 years prior. They believed a great king was to be born out of the lands from which the star shone directly over. According to these magi, they were certain this land was Judea, and had thus arrived with gifts of frankincense, myrrh, and gold for a child born within Herod's court. All who were present looked puzzled, for no child had been born into the family over the last 2 years. It was then that Herod's cunning son, Antipater the heir, a man well versed in the scriptures, mentioned that the appearance of the star lined up perfectly with the prophecy laid down by Isaiah that a king from the line of David will be born out of Bethlehem. Herod played along with this idea, much to Antipater's liking, and beckoned the Magi to continue on to Bethlehem and present their gifts to this new king with his own blessing. He told them to return with the child's location so that he could go there and worship him. But when the Magi never returned, a great madness took a hold of Herod. He confided his worries with me. He stated that if such was true, this king who was to be born would have a claim to the throne secured by the very scriptures themselves. It would be a claim stronger than that of the Hasmoneans who had ruled for a century prior, and definitely stronger than his own claim, which had only been secured by Rome. For all his life he had lived in the shadow of his Idumean ancestry, which would never see him fully accepted by the local Jewish population. This fact had grieved him for his entire reign, and he had sought the comfort of countless concubines to ease the burden that such knowledge bore on him. He always had Rome to fall back on when trouble called, but who could support him against trouble caused by the very God he was devoted to? He locked himself in his chambers, letting such thoughts churn in his mind. When he emerged, he had come to a conclusion. God intended to usurp a devout follower who had only ever expressed his love for him. He had been unjustly betrayed by the Most High, but unlike Job, Herod would not endure it. He would rebel. And so, it was that male children under 2 years of age in Bethlehem were to be executed. As a mother, my heart screamed at this decision. I immediately chided my older brother for considering such a monstrous move. And I wasn't the only one to make my distaste known. His sons, Antipas, Archelaus, and Philip, also stressed what a disaster such a move would be for his reign. Not only would it taint his name forever, but he would likely lose the loyalty of the soldiers he'd send out to complete the horrid task. I think those sons cared more for the decision's threat to their future prospects rather than for the innocent lives at stake. Antipater was notably absent. Somehow we managed to get through to him, and thought we could rest in peace with the knowledge that his blood lust for the young boys of Bethlehem was sated. But 2 days later, in the early hours before sunrise, whilst I was visiting David Ben-Kfir, who resided close to the Dung Gate of Jerusalem, a commotion outside that gate caught my eye. Robed figures armed to the teeth were being cajoled by none other than Antipater the heir. They were a rough-looking lot, and I knew that none of them belonged to Herod's army. Having witnessed several attempts at overthrowing Herod over the last couple of years, my initial fear was that Antipater had finally become fed up of his father's prolonged life and decided to make his move to ascend the throne sooner, hiring thugs to do his dirty work. With the safety of my daughter and grandchildren at the forefront of my mind, I immediately hurried back to the palace and barged into my brother's chambers, awakening him and relaying what I had seen. He merely laughed. "Sister, Antipater is fulfilling my orders. But why the secrecy? Why the thugs instead of your own men?" "Because thugs aren't soldiers of Herod," he replied, meaning that what they are about to do should have no connection to me. I felt at great unease. "What have you ordered them?" "To enact the decision I had already made. To eliminate the male children of Bethlehem born within the last 2 years." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "But you told your 3 sons and I that you would reconsider that decision. You agreed that it was too rash, too horrid." Herod raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I will admit that my original strategy to undertake it was quite flawed. Antipater helped me realize a better way of getting the deed done without smearing my name. The hiring of thugs to conduct the attack will look little more than a petty raid, and they won't even kill the children there. No, they are to take them alive to a designated destination where they are to be dispatched in secrecy. The parents will never know what happened to their sons. Hopefully they can just settle on the false hope that the thugs sold them into slavery or whatever. All that matters is that my name will not be tied to it. The thugs will also be dispatched as soon as they've dealt with the children. In the end, it'll only be myself, Antipater, a handful of loyal bodyguards, and now you, Salome, who will ever know." I was incredulous. Without a second thought, I slapped my brother across the face. "You monster! The boys are innocent! How could you kill them over some stupid bit of superstition?" Herod fixed me with a cold stare. Had I not been his beloved sister, death would have swiftly been my due for my impulsive outburst. "Watch what you say, Salome. You think I want to do this?" He pointed his finger firmly to the ceiling. "Blame him! He who desires to usurp me. If those magi had returned, I would have known the exact location of this prophesied king, and only one child would have had to die. But they never returned, and I still don't know which child is this usurper. So, I must take care of all possibilities." His eyes twinkled as a thought occurred to him. "You know what? The blame for the coming deaths can fall on those stupid magicians." "No, Herod, the blame is solely yours," I said. I was all out of tears. Herod scoffed. "What are a few dead children in the grand scheme of things, Salome? I do this to secure the right that our family has earned to hold this throne. It's not for my own benefit, but for my sons and your children. Our father would have done the same thing." I knew our beloved father would never have done such a thing, but I kept that to myself. I loathed Antipater for his part in this, and knew all too well that he was taking advantage of his father's weakened mind. As overcautious as Herod was trying to be, I knew, and Antipater would know too, that word of this will get around the country, and everyone will swiftly realize it was Herod's doing. It was a great way to sow distaste in the old king and preference to rise for the heir to take up the throne. I knew that arguing further was not going to change anything. Already those thugs were on their way to Bethlehem. If I could do anything, I had to get away from Herod and act fast. I dismissed myself from my brother and immediately went back to David ben Kafir, the old acquaintance I had been seeing. This recount is being recorded in the final years of my life, so I bear no shame in admitting that David was my lover and the true father of my daughter Berenice. Even throughout the 3 forced marriages, I had to endure. The sweet love that blossomed between David and I when I first entered womanhood had never faltered. He was the husband of my heart. Looking back now, a part of me regrets informing him. But at the time, I knew I had to. He would never have forgiven me if I had withheld the information. Even though it would cost him his life, I know David looks down on me with gratitude. For his nephew Joseph was present within Bethlehem with his young family. His wife had only just given birth to a baby boy in a stable on the outskirts of town. Even in his old age, David was never too shy for a fight, and within minutes of learning the threat to his nephew's son, we were mounted on his horse together, for the last time, and rode to Bethlehem. When we arrived, the sky was just beginning to brighten, but we were already too late. A light breeze carried the heart-wrenching chorus of wailing screams to our doomed ears. The 100 or so thugs were already departing with their spoils. Rough hands dragged the confused and terrified little boys who were able to walk, ignorant of their cries for their mothers. The ones who had not learned to walk yet were cruelly thrown into large pens that had been constructed on several wagons. The helpless newborns and infants within were trampled by the older toddlers crawling about screaming for their parents. I felt faint and nearly collapsed from the horse. David dismounted and caught me, lowering me to the ground. The image of the crying, doomed children being led away brought upon the sensation of 1,000 knives being thrust into my heart, slowly draining me of my life force. "We must help them," I said, my voice little more than a whimper. David clenched his jaw and shook his head, the veins of his temples bulging like worms. "There is little one man can do for them. God give them mercy." "Joseph's boy." "Do they have him?" I said as my vision began to blur from all the tears. "I couldn't tell," David said. He turned to the city. "But those bastards are still going around in parties searching for children that might have been hidden along the outskirts. Come, I think Joseph's boy can still be saved." David helped me to my feet and led me through the olive shrubs towards the town. We evaded the thugs and reached a slightly hidden cave that was being used to house livestock. We nudged our way through the bleating goats and sheep. A fleeting wave of relief washed over me when we stumbled upon Joseph and his family. All three slept, oblivious to the horror taking place less than half a mile away. David violently shook Joseph awake and urged him to get his family out of Bethlehem at once. Joseph didn't argue and wasted no time waking his wife up as they hastily loaded their donkey with their meager belongings, the most precious cargo of all remaining asleep in a bundle within his mother's arms. David swiftly filled Joseph in on what Herod had done. He urged his nephew to go into Egypt until Herod died, which he and I both knew was not long coming. They had just departed down the field to the south when a dozen thugs spotted them and immediately gave chase. Joseph tugged clumsily on the reins to get at the donkey to move faster, nearly jerking his wife off the beast. With growing dread, I knew that the thugs would overtake them soon. "Stay in here, Salome," David said, as he pulled out his sling and loaded it with a clay shot. "I won't let your accursed brother take another child. I'll be back." He kissed my lips, and how I wish I had savored every moment of it. He stormed out of the cave and disappeared under the cover of olive bushes. I would never see him alive again. I waited for hours until I could tell by the shade outside that it was well into noon. The agonized screams that seemed to echo across the landscape gradually died down, and I knew that all the thugs had finally departed. But David never returned. Feeling that it was safe to do so, I left the cave and carefully made my way through the field I had last seen Joseph and his family. I came to a rocky track that wounded down a steep slope which provided an exquisite view of the rolling hills to the south. Bodies of thugs were scattered about the place, and I knew it had been David's handiwork. I came to a bend, and alas, there my lover lay, in a pool of his own blood with a knife wound in his chest. I screamed as I collapsed beside him and covered his cooling face with kisses he had once relished. I cried over his corpse for what felt like hours. When I finally recovered, I stared vacantly out at the rolling hills in the distance, reflecting on all that had come to pass. I despised both my brother and Antipater more than ever. I wondered if the poor little boys had reached their final destination, and prayed in my heart that if there was any mercy left in Herod, he would give them swift ends. My eyes just managed to make out the tiny shape of a donkey on one of the distant hills, and I could vaguely see a draped figure sitting atop it. It was being led at a hasty pace, and from the clumsy way the figure was tugging at the reins, I knew it was Joseph and his family. David had given his life to ensure they could get away. Despite all the despair I had endured that day, the image of the family on the distant hill would forever be branded into my heart as a symbol of hope. After all of Herod's efforts to eliminate the young boys of Bethlehem, one had still got a way. Deep down, I hoped it was the prophesied king. It would mean that Herod's horrific deed had all been in vain. That last thought, however, only made my despair swiftly return. For it would mean that those poor children that had been taken away had died for nothing. I never got a chance to bury David and know not what ever happened to his body. In the days that followed, a great depression gripped me, and I wanted no part in Herod's court for the rest of his reign. He was ailing fast, and I knew his death would come within the year. With my daughter, Berenice, and her children, we retired to the fortress of Hyrcania, where I spent a great deal of time mourning David and the condemned boys of Bethlehem. I chose this fortress over all the others, for it was the one that Herod least frequented. I knew that my daughter and her children would be safe here, in case Herod was to pull any final extreme actions towards his own family before his death. With Antipater close to his ear, I thought such a possibility was likely. No attempt was made to reach out to me for a week, that is, until Antipater showed up at the gates of Hyrcania with a century of Herod's soldiers. My initial reaction was that my very fears were about to come to pass. But alas, that would not be the case. Having made sure Berenice and the children were safely hidden, I went down to the courtyard to intercept Antipater. Ready for my brother's soldiers to take me away, I was surprised when they just stood behind their leader, staring at me with weary eyes. I switched my gaze to Antipater, but only saw a hopeful expression, doused with the slightest hint of fear. "Well met, Aunt," he addressed me. "I have come under some rather dire circumstances that we need your assistance with. My father has not been himself since the business in Bethlehem and refuses to be consoled by anyone. It seems that grief for the deed he ordered has caught up with him. I believe the soft voice of his dear sister may be the antidote to his current predicament." I shot Antipater a steely gaze and had to fight all my urge to lunge out at him as I did to Herod. The indifference in this arrogant prince's voice when mentioning the atrocity that had taken place was infuriating. "You wicked man! You who played Herod's already weakened mind are the true perpetrator of the injustice in Bethlehem. Had you not intervened, he would have forgotten all about that accursed idea." Antipater only smiled. "I only gave my advice. It was he that made the order. What guilt he feels for that deed is not my concern. Well, I hope it gives you comfort to know that one child got away. One who I hope is the prophesied king, that will return to avenge all those innocent lives taken, not only by Herod's order, but by your manipulative tongue." Antipater shrugged dismissively. "Think what you wish, Aunt. It matters little to me. But what does matter is getting Herod back to Jerusalem and away from that damned cave before all of Judea knows what he's done." "Cave? What cave?" "The very one where the children were slain and yet lie. He has not left that damned place since he arrived to give the order to dispatch the thugs. He eats, sleeps, and weeps outside of it. He is adamant that the children deserve a better resting place than a mere cave in the Judean hills." I felt a chill rattle my bones. My brother's madness had officially reached its peak. Mourning for the very children he ordered to kill, the idea that had originally sprouted from his own head, any tears he shed for them would be more bitter than the waters of the Dead Sea itself. He didn't deserve to mourn them. "I need you to help bring him back to his senses. Please." And so it was that with great reluctance, I left Hyrcania with Antipater's convoy and made the 3-day northern journey to the city of Phasaelus. From there, we ventured west into the wild hill country. We came to a deep gorge, and after traversing through it for a short distance, reached a large and ornate tent that had been used by members of my household during long campaigns. We dismounted our horses, and Antipater led me through the tent's flaps. Under normal circumstances, such a tent would have been adorned with all sorts of luxuries, slaves, and decorations. Instead, emptiness lay within those hide covers, occasionally broken by a stoic bodyguard standing at attention, and a half-dozen pots containing water and dried fruit. No carpets adorned the rocky ground, and there, kneeling with his head against a large stone slab on the far side of the tent, was Herod. He keened as he wept and pounded his head against the stone, soft enough to not give himself a concussion. He was muttering something that I could not quite make out from my position. Antipater leaned towards me. "He has been in that exact spot for the last week. I had no choice but to erect the tent and bring some supplies. He has not eaten, and The only time he drank was when I had to pour it down his throat. With the amount of noise coming out of him, it's a wonder his throat hasn't seized. I didn't have to ask what lay behind the large stone he was striking his head against. I tried with all my will not to imagine the grisly sight within. But when I saw the dried-up puddles of red at the base of that stone, vivid imagery of what had occurred at this place filled my mind, and my composure slipped. Bile entered my gorge, and I vomited against the wall of the tent. Seeing my brother's mad hysteria taking place against the backdrop of pure horror, all I wanted was to get away. Antipater must have seen my intentions, for when I turned to exit the tent, he immediately gripped my shoulder and forced me back. "You're not going anywhere, Ant." He pulled a small dagger from under his tunic and held it a short distance from my throat. "You will only be leaving this place with my father. If not, I guess he'll have something else to mourn for." Behind that rock, even though the threat reverberated through my mind, it paled in comparison to my desire to leave that place for good. Should I fail to get through to my brother, and death be my only way out of this accursed location, then so be it. I ripped myself from that wicked man's grasp and made my way towards Herod, desired to get this ordeal over with my priority. I stood behind my brother's wretched form and for a moment felt pity for him. But then he started to talk, not to me, but to the stone slab, or to something that was communicating to him from behind that stone slab. Please, I didn't want to do it. I only did what I thought to be fair. I know only one of you was the promised king, but I just had to make sure. A silence as Herod cocked his head, seemingly listening to something. Please stop accusing me. By all the gods known to man, I swear that my heart is turned to pulp under the burden of what I've done. But please know it's not my fault. It was God that forced my hand. He threatened to usurp a devout follower of his, a king who had only ever done right by his law. I had to take action. Again, the silence. This time, Herod placed both hands on the stone before pressing his ear hard against it. Yes, No, he got away. But again, that's not my fault. If things went as I planned, only the one that got away would have perished. Again, that blame falls to others. If those magi had returned as I ordered, all of you would have lived. I was a fool to have placed my trust in foreigners. Please, from the bottom of my heart, forgive me for my poor judgment. If there is any way I can alleviate at least some of the burden of what I have done to you, then know I am at your service. I'll do anything you say. You have my word as King of Judea." Herod lay on the ground at the foot of the stone, as though he was humbling himself before a great monarch. The renewed silence gave me enough time to absorb the image of my once unfaltering and prideful brother groveling in the dirt. It was unnerving. Suddenly, Herod jolted his head up and winced at the stone with a look of momentary confusion upon his grimy face. He then smiled. "Me? You want me? Fine, I'm all yours. Take me now and do as you wish." Herod held out his arms in supplication as he awaited what response might occur to him. He slowly lowered his arms and began to shake his head from side to side, his Adam's apple bobbing up and down like a satyr thrusting vigorously into a nymph. "Not yet? For how much longer then? Let me be free of this torment and join you." The foe, pleading in his tone, the desire to be with whatever he was communicating with, made me shudder. I was beginning to think that it was not just his own messed-up thoughts he was speaking with. For the first time, the idea of it being the spirits of the dead occurred to me. As abruptly as the thought came, Herod turned his face towards me, noticing me for the first time. He sighed before he spoke. "The thugs who killed them are not enough, Salome. They want me, and I've got absolutely no quarrel with that. If they'd allow it, I'd go to them now, but they need me to do some things before I can do so. They want me to assure that their deaths were not in vain. I am to focus these final months of my life, ensuring that the one who lived does not take my throne as God intends. I am to do whatever it takes. Only when that is achieved will they accept me into their vengeful hands." I think it was the causal way in which he spoke those words to me, as though it was just a normal topic of conversation that disturbed me the most. Antipater had come beside me, and he too was visibly shaken with what he had heard. We both stood like statues as Herod got back up to his feet and placed a wrinkly hand on each of our shoulders. I'll be needing the advice of my two closest family members over the coming months. Stay close, do as I say, and I assure a generous return to come your way. He paid particular attention to Antipater, cupping his eldest son's chin as though he was still a boy. I will admit now, my son, you will have a better return than Salome. They want you too. Herod laughed and kissed Antipater on the cheek. What a privilege! Antipater's mouth drooped in response to that, and as we looked at each other, I knew he did not share his father's enthusiasm for this great reward. I didn't blame him. As trapped as I was in this situation, no words could describe the relief I felt that Berenice and my grandchildren were far from Herod's court and would remain so whilst he lived. So, we returned to Jerusalem. The journey had been much slower than usual, for the gangrene that was ailing Herod had gotten worse, making it difficult for him to do little more than lie down on a litter that we had to bring in from Jericho. But when we entered the city through the eastern temple gates, something caught Herod's eye that myself and Antipater had failed to notice. At once, he leaped off his litter as though he had returned his youthful vigor and hurried in the direction of the Temple Mount. Antipater scrabbled for control of the situation and hastily ordered the soldiers to follow after him. In the confusion, I was plopped off my horse and left stranded as the men all went to protect their king. A crowd of Pharisees were beginning to flock to the place Herod was, and I was swept along with them. I fell and probably have been trampled to death had Antipater not pulled me out of the way. I followed him to the source of all the commotion, at the main gate to the inner sanctum of the temple. Herod stood below the arch, his face a mask of fury as he held up a piece of a golden bird's wing. When we came to his side, I saw that it was a section of what had been a much larger piece, the golden eagle in which he had placed here in honor of Caesar Augustus. You ungrateful fools, he bellowed at the gathering crowd below. They were beginning to shove against the soldiers who had formed a defensive wall around our position, caring little for the spears pointing at them. Herod thrust his finger to the sky. Is this what he ordered? A voice cried out from the crowd. You! Corrupt these holy walls with your idols. The Lord will not allow it. I could see Herod's fist clench at his side and begin to shake under the tension. Just as he has already plotted to overthrow me, is that right? There was no direct response to this, only an increase in the cacophony of the crowd. Herod roared in response. If you think you can pave the way for the usurper, you are all mistaken. He may have survived the slaughter, but I will not allow him to ascend the throne. The children will it. I see that he has already harvested you lot as followers for his cause. Then to the harvest of treason you all shall go. Herod turned to his soldiers and shouted, Kill them! Kill them all! There was a few moments' delay as the soldiers processed the order, but sure enough, the killing began. I stood against the arch of the holiest place in all Judea and watched in stunned silence as blood was spilled on the steps and confusion and panic settled amongst the crowd. All the while, Herod laughed. He laughed as though it was the funniest thing he had ever witnessed. Even Antipater was appalled. When the killing had moved deeper into the courtyard, Herod turned to Antipater. I want the instigators of this sacrilege arrested and any who might have followed them killed. I don't care how high the death toll grows. It is the request of the children. Their deaths cannot be in vain. Remember that. A handful of soldiers remained, and they escorted myself and Herod back to the palace, my sandals becoming crimson as I walked the path where death had been. I remained silent the whole time, not wishing to have my presence known to my brother. Appalled is too generous a word to give to my mindset in that moment. The retribution killings for the tearing down of the eagle continued for 3 days. In the end, the death toll rose well into the hundreds, and the instigators surrendered themselves in order to avert further deaths. Despite their honorable surrender, Herod held not the slightest bit of sympathy for them, and these dozen Pharisees had their feet severed before being burned alive. I was forced to watch, and as those unfortunate men writhed in torment under the flames, Herod shouted at the sky, Here, have your followers. They can serve you in your kingdom, not mine. Over the next weeks, the gangrene got worse, to the point of reaching his groin and making him unable to walk. It only added to the madness that possessed him, and more heads began to roll. he drowned in suspicion of his own manufacture, that everyone around him was conspiring in some way that would assist the usurper to his throne. His mission to avert the ascension of the one who lived drove all of his killings, even to the point where he killed members of his court, household, and even servants for merely moving in slightly the wrong way. It seemed that only myself and Antipater were immune to his wrath. With every death, even those of the innocent, he would utter the same response to their pleas for life. Why should you live when they never got the chance to? The happenings in Jerusalem swiftly spread across all of Judea, and the population began to despise Herod more than ever. Few even dared come to Jerusalem, not keen on taking the chance with so much blood being spilled there. Sure enough, Herod noticed this absence of visitors to his capital and immediately concluded that the country was rallying to the banner of the one who lived. He was convinced that an army would march into the city at any moment, so he ordered his court moved to Jericho as a countermeasure, and here is when his madness reached its absolute pinnacle. He summoned Antipater and I to his chamber that reeked of decay and told us his final order. I am dying, and intend to return to the children before death evades me from them forever. There is one more thing I need to do to ensure their deaths were not in vain. I fear there will be little mourning when I die. But there will be mourning, mark my words. All of Judea will mourn their choice of supporting the usurper. I want every notable Jewish family throughout the kingdom brought to the hippodrome here in Jericho. If they refuse, then round up every female from the village, noble lineage or not, and bring them in their stead. The same fate will await either of them. They'll all get to serve their God soon enough. I felt all the love I once held for my brother evaporate at once. Surely this was some scare tactic, I thought to myself, but given the extreme measures the ailing king had taken in the past, I knew he meant every word that he said. And one last thing. I wished to return to the children. I prefer to spend my last days there than in this cesspit of the ungrateful living. Antipater and I looked at each other, and both of us knew. This was the final straw. When you have them all in the hippodrome, come to notify me. The children may have a creative way to bring about their demise. As I watched the ailing Herod leave with his escort of bodyguards to the tomb of the children within the Judean hills, I hoped with all my heart that he would die along the way, making his horrible order nothing more than a passing wind. Until we heard that Herod was dead, Antipater and I were left to conduct this final order. We were both reluctant, and had it not been for eager captains of the army wanting one final promotion or reward from the king before his death for their efforts, we would not have done anything about it. Those captains were fiercely loyal, and we dared not get in their way. Alas, the notable families were all round up and brought to Jericho, where they were placed in the hippodrome. I was given some measure of hope for the honor of Judea, for not one family allowed the girls of their village to be taken in their stead. Thousands of confused and emotional people filled that place, and I knew with all my heart that Herod's order, the children's order, could never be fulfilled. Even if it was to cost me my life, I simply could not allow it. With the families all gathered in Jericho as requested, Antipater and I rode out together to the tomb. When we were not too far away, Antipater jumped from his horse and pulled me aside. He fixed me with an intent gaze. Salome, whatever he orders us to do next, we cannot allow it. This has gone too far. If he has all those families massacred, I don't even think Rome will allow our family to continue governing this country. If there is any hope for our family, I pray that you condone what I am about to tell you. I intend to kill him. Our whole lives had been thwart with attempted assassinations, many being averted due to my interference. Herod owed his life to me on a number of occasions, but for the first time, I was not going to intervene. I merely nodded my assent. We soon arrived at the same tent that Antipater had erected and were greeted by 2 sentries. Their faces were pale, and I could tell that they desired to be anywhere but this place. I felt much the same. Recognizing us, they immediately opened the flaps and followed us inside. 10 other bodyguards were standing casually about the place, and when they noticed our presence, they immediately stiffened to attention. Their captain, Boaz, came to us. I froze when my eyes adjusted to the interior and saw a feature that hadn't been present when I was last there. The large stone slab that Herod had been talking to was now rolled aside, revealing a large gaping cave in the mountain. Inside was pure darkness. All of my instincts screamed to not go in there, to not to be anywhere near it. "Where is Herod?" Antipater asked with authority. "Why is the tomb rolled back?" The captain paused before us, his Adam's apples bobbing, up and down. "The king requested it to be opened. He is inside." "Inside?" Antipater scoffed. I could sense a tinge of relief in his tone. "Do you mean to say that the king has passed, and you lot have failed to bring word of this to us?" The captain shook his head. No, he is not dead. Herod wishes to spend his final days in there. He ordered a sarcophagus to be made as we passed through Phaselis. The stonemason completed it within the day, for the king did not request anything more than it being made to size. He has been residing in it, and talking all the time. I try not to think about who he might be talking to. My breathing became heavy. Antipater shook his head, an expression of sheer determination upon his face. "This has gone on long enough." He placed a reassuring hand upon the captain's shoulder. "But today it ends. Come, Salome, it is time to put the old king out of his misery." Antipater was given a torch by one of the guards and slowly made his way into the cave.